This comparison is between monolithic applications and the ones that use the Microfrontends approach. Now, let's start with Microfrontends. What are they? Are they just microservices for the frontend? Question mark. Well, not really. The key difference is that if you deploy one single microservice, you have a backend application. But if you deploy a single microfrontend, you still need some logic for that microfrontend to be displayed. So not really. The definitions that I like is that it's an independently deliverable UI components, although that can come with a question mark as well. To better understand what a microfrontends are, I really love the following example, and this is like a basic example. Everyone of you, I'm sure, has stumbled upon this in your daily web browsing. So imagine a simple login screen, and if we click on the sign in with Google button, we get redirected to a different page. Now, I understand that this doesn't really look like microfrontends, but if we go back to a single definition that microfrontends are individually deployable components, are those two websites individually deployable? Sure, Twitter can deploy their landing page, login page as often as they'd like, and Google can deploy their page as often as they'd like. Although in this particular example, they are on different domains and they look more like a multiple page application, which is a pretty cool example that I would like to talk more of, but not today. So please subscribe and stay tuned when I dive into the difference for the microfrontends between the single page application and the multiple page application. For now, let's try to find a concrete example that we can compare the two approaches. So let's imagine a simple e-commerce website. A simple e-commerce website, of course, has a product component, basically a product page with a product picture, some short description, a button, add to basket. Then again, of course, a basic e-commerce website has a product list component, basically a list of all of the products when you search for them or just browse through the categories. Of course, you have a basket, and of course, you need a checkout. Now, in this example, if you are talking about these components in the microfrontend approach, between the basket and the checkout components, we can actually kind of deploy them on different domains, and some of the companies actually do that because the only information that needs to be passed from the basket to the checkout is a list and the quantity of products. And this can be like a hybrid approach between the monolithic and the microfrontend application. But let's stick to our example. Let's imagine we have two projects, same components, same identical website, same everything. The only difference is that the first one is a monolith. Basically, if you want to deploy something, well, I wanted to say that the key difference is that the monolith is in a single monorepo, and the microfrontends each have individual repos, but you can have microfrontends in a single repository. The key difference is that if you want to change something in the monolith, you need to redeploy everything. And let's imagine we have two almost identical applications, with the only difference is that the first one uses a monolith approach and the second one uses a microfrontend approach. Now, of course, we already have the code base and we need some way of getting that code base to the end users. We need some way of getting that code to production. So, of course, we have a pipeline. The pipeline needs to first build it, then test it, and then deploy it to production. Let's do a quick comparison for the build time. Let's imagine that on our product page, on our product component, we want to add a single line that actually gets the information from the API in the product object, and it gets the information whether the project is currently on a holiday sale. Now, for the monolithic application, we go ahead and add that component, quite simple. Then when we actually want to deploy it, we'll need to build the entire application. We'll need to build the product list, we'll need to build the basket, we'll need to build the checkout, we'll need to build everything. Of course, the more files we have, the longer it takes. For the Microfrontend application, it's a bit different because we need to only build the component that actually has changed. So we only are building the product component. Now for the testing, it's quite a similar situation because in a monolithic application, you will need to run all of the tests. Now, of course, there are some workarounds, but in general, you're running all of them. You're running all of the tests. For the Microfrontends, you're running only the product-related tests, and this is like a best practice, some end-to-end integration tests to make sure that your product component plays nice with all of the other components. For the deployment, it's a bit different. I mean, you might think that the difference is not that big. We have built the application, we have like our artifacts, now we only need to deploy it. Microfrontends are still a bit better in this regard because for the Microfrontends you only need to deploy this single component, while for the monolith you need to deploy the full application. Now let's move on after the brief overall comparison, let's move on to some more defined comparison. How do we actually compare? Let's define the metrics. Let's figure out which quality attributes actually apply to this comparison and pick those, and then we'll be able to rate how each approach actually works for each quality attribute. So the first one is maintainability. Maintainability is basically the ability to maintain the code base. Sounds kind of redundant, but it's the ability to introduce change, the ease of introducing a change to the code base. I think it's very applicable to this comparison. The next one is reusability, how it's easy to actually reuse some of the code. For example, like a single button or some headers, basically any component that can be used in multiple places, how easy it is for us to reuse it. Then we have availability, and availability is basically how often we cannot access the web application. For this comparison, I don't think it's really applicable. The two approaches do not make a difference. Do not make a huge difference, at least in my opinion. For performance, sure, I think we can include this. Reliability, it's arguable, but let's leave it out for now. Security, again, arguably it does have an impact, but I think we can leave it out for this quick comparison. Testability, definitely we need to include in this comparison, as I think that testability will have a different score for different approaches, as the same goes for deployability. Now I think we can we should be fine with those 5 quality attributes, although I would add another quality attribute that I discovered on a recent project that I'm on, is A/B testability. It sounds weird, but A/B testing is very important in a recent, or maybe not that quite recent, data-driven decision-making approach. So let's move and check how I actually scored each quality attribute for each approach. Now, for the maintainability, the monolith actually, well, let's go through the scoring methods, of course. The 1 means like terrible score, means this approach doesn't actually satisfy at all. And the 5, of course, means super best, super cool. So for the monolith, I rated the maintainability as 3. And basically the idea is that the larger the code base you have, the harder it is to navigate around. I mean, of course, there can be large code bases that are easy to navigate through, but that requires additional effort. And with the microfrontends, each microfrontend is isolated, and that's why I gave microfrontends a 4 on the maintainability scale. Now, for reusability, the monolith actually gets a 5 because everything is in the single code base, and if I want to reuse some specific component from, let's imagine, from checkout, I can just go ahead and import it. Now, granted, it doesn't always make sense, but I can do it. And the microfrontends are actually scoring lower on the reusability simply because it's not that easy to reuse something that you're using in one microfrontend and to reuse it in the second microfrontend, because you need some overhead for, you need to first extract that component and you need to create some overhead, and it's not that easy. Now for performance, let's move on to performance for the monolith. I scored it as a 4. Well, because monolith cannot do it's hard for the monolith to score low, but again, it's easy for the monolith to score, well, it's hard for the monolith to score high, but it's easy for the monolith to score low because you are just bundling everything. And of course, there are different approaches, different methods to splitting the load time, but generally, I think they are pretty similar in the performance. For the testability, the monolith gets a 3 simply because you have to test, basically you have to test everything and you have to retest everything to make sure that you didn't break anything. And for the microfrontends, the testability is 5, simply because there are numerous approaches that allow you to actually test this specific microfrontend in integration with the other microfrontends without the need to rebuild all of the other microfrontends, because basically you already have them built and you can jump in and test it in integration. Right. Deployability for the monolith, I rated it as a 2, simply because, well, you need to deploy everything. Even if you change a color of a single button, you need to redeploy the whole application. You need to redeploy the components that have absolutely no connection to the component you've changed. And for the microfrontends, I rated it as a 5 because you can individually deploy the components, and that is the definition of the microfrontends, and you can be pretty safe that if you make some small change, it would not affect the rest of the application. And for the A/B testability, the monolith gets a 3 because, well, if you want to A/B test something, you put a bunch of if statements in the monolith to decide which component to actually show, and you ship both of the components, regardless of whether the end user will see them or not. You ship both of the components to the client. Now, with the microfrontends, on the other hand, you can actually split the variants into different artifacts. So basically, if you want to A/B test the color of the button, or if you want to A/B test an additional field like coupon field in the basket, you want to add the coupon field as an A/B test, you can actually split the resulting artifacts into microfrontends into 2 artifacts and decide before loading, which variant you want to ship to the user and download only that variant, which is pretty cool. Okay, I think I've made it in the scope of 15 minutes. And that is all for my quick architectural comparison. Thank you for watching, and if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the comments.